The charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum buzzed with Manhattan's elite, their conversations a symphony of dropped names and calculated networking. Adrian Blackwood surveyed the crowd from his position near the Grecian artifacts, a crystal tumbler of aged whiskey in his manicured hand. At 32, he commanded respect in every room he entered, CEO of Blackwood Industries, worth north of $800 million, and possessor of the kind of sharp-edged handsomeness that graced magazine covers. He was discussing a potential merger with Senator Richardson when she appeared in his peripheral vision like a disruption in the universe's carefully ordered plans. The woman wore a purple bodycon dress that seemed painted onto her curves, the rich amethyst fabric catching the museum's golden lighting and transforming it into something almost otherworldly. The dress hugged every line of her body with shameless confidence, its deep V neckline and thigh-high slit suggesting secrets, while revealing just enough to make every man in the vicinity forget their own names. But it wasn't just the dress. Though Adrian found himself momentarily speechless at the sight of how it molded to her figure. It was the way she carried herself. Like she owned the room without needing to prove it. She was laughing at something her companion said, her head thrown back in genuine mirth, dark hair cascading over one shoulder. Everything about her posture screamed authenticity in a room full of calculated poses. "Excuse me?" Adrian murmured to the senator, already moving toward her like a moth to flame. He'd perfected his approach over the years, the right combination of confidence and subtle dominance that never failed to intrigue. Women typically melted under his attention, charmed by his wealth and the dangerous edge that corporate power had honed into his personality. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said, appearing at her elbow with the smooth precision of a predator. "Adrian Blackwood." She turned, and he found himself looking into eyes the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of silver that seemed to see straight through his practiced charm. Her lips, painted a shade that perfectly matched her dress, curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I know exactly who you are," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement that immediately put him on guard. "The question is whether you're as interesting as your reputation suggests, or just another rich boy playing dress-up in Daddy's tuxedo." Adrian blinked. In 15 years of adult social interaction, no woman had ever responded to his introduction with such casual dismissal. The few people within earshot suddenly found their champagne glasses fascinating, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded either spectacular fireworks or complete devastation. "I beg your pardon?" His voice carried the edge that made corporate rivals reconsider their strategies. She sipped her wine, a bold red that matched her audacity, and studied him with the clinical interest of an entomologist examining a particularly predictable specimen. Adrian Blackwood, 32, inherited 70% of his fortune, graduated Harvard Business with adequate marks, and hasn't had an original thought since his trust fund matured. You collect vintage cars, date models who can't spell controversy, and think expensive suits make you interesting. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Adrian felt heat creep up his neck, a sensation he hadn't experienced since childhood. Around them, conversations had subtly paused, the social elite's predatory instincts sensing blood in the water. "You seem to have done your research," he said, fighting to keep his voice level. "Should I be flattered or concerned?" "Neither. You should be grateful someone's finally telling you the truth instead of kissing your ass for access to your bank account." She finished her wine and set the glass on a passing waiter's tray with fluid grace. "Though, I suppose that's all you're used to, isn't it? People performing for your money?" Something dangerous flickered in Adrian's dark eyes. He stepped closer, close enough to catch the intoxicating scent of her perfume, jasmine with notes of rebellion. "And what exactly do you do, Miss Elena Vasquez?" "I restore art for people who actually appreciate it rather than buying it to fill empty walls in empty houses." Her gaze swept over him dismissively. I work for my money, every dollar of it. The subtle emphasis on work hit him like a physical blow. Adrian Blackwood, who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will, found himself speechless for the second time in 10 minutes. Elena smoothed the purple fabric of her dress with deliberate slowness, the gesture drawing his attention to curves that had been haunting his peripheral vision since she'd appeared. "Enjoy your evening, Mr. Blackwood. Try not to let all that inherited privilege weigh you down too heavily." She walked away, her hips swaying in that devastating dress, leaving Adrian standing frozen among the ancient artifacts like he'd just been turned to stone by some modern Medusa. The conversations around him resumed with the hungry buzz of scandal, but he heard none of it. For the first time in his adult life, someone had looked at Adrian Blackwood and found him wanting. And, God help him, he'd never been more intrigued by anything in his life. 3 weeks. 21 days since Elena Vasquez had eviscerated his ego at the Metropolitan Museum, and Adrian couldn't get her out of his head. He'd tried everything, throwing himself into work, scheduling dates with women who worshipped at the altar of his bank account, even taking his Bugatti for midnight drives through the city. Nothing worked. She haunted him like a fever dream wrapped in purple silk. "Sir?" Marcus, his assistant, peered around the office door with carefully neutral expression. "The Patterson merger documents are ready for your review." Adrian stared out at the Manhattan skyline, seeing nothing but storm-gray eyes and a mouth that had delivered the most devastating critique of his life. "Did you find her?" Marcus sighed, a sound that spoke of 3 weeks of increasingly desperate requests. Elena Vasquez, 29, graduated summa cum laude from NYU with a master's in art conservation. She freelances for several high-end galleries and private collectors, lives in a rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn, drives a 15-year-old Honda, and, according to my sources, turned down a job offer from the Guggenheim last month because she didn't want to be tied down to institutional politics. Why did she turn it down? She said, and I quote, "I'd rather eat ramen and maintain my integrity than compromise my principles for a steady paycheck." Marcus consulted his tablet. She also volunteers at a community center, teaching art to underprivileged kids every Saturday. Of course she did. Adrian closed his eyes, seeing her again in that bodycon dress that had made his blood sing, the way the purple fabric had clung to every curve like a second skin designed to drive him slowly insane. The memory of how she'd looked, confident, untouchable, devastatingly beautiful, had been torturing him for weeks. "What else?" "She's clean, sir. No debt beyond student loans, no criminal record, no scandals. Her colleagues describe her as brilliant, passionate, and completely unimpressed by wealth or status." Marcus paused. "Also, she's currently working on restoring a private collection for the Pemberton family." Adrian's head snapped around. "The Pembertons? They're clients." "Yes, sir. In fact, you have dinner with James Pemberton tomorrow night to discuss the Hartford acquisition." For the first time in 3 weeks, Adrian smiled. The Pemberton estate in the Hamptons sprawled across 12 acres of manicured perfection, its Georgian architecture a testament to old money's refined tastes. Adrian arrived precisely on time, dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that had cost more than most people's cars, his dark hair perfectly styled and his jaw clean-shaven. He looked every inch the successful mogul, but his pulse hammered with the anticipation of a teenager about to ask someone to prom. James Pemberton, 73 and sharp as his antique letter opener, greeted him in the foyer. "Adrian, wonderful to see you. Come, I want to show you something extraordinary before dinner." They walked through halls lined with priceless art toward what Pemberton called his restoration room, a converted conservatory where damaged pieces received expert care. Adrian's heart rate spiked as they approached, every nerve in his body suddenly hyper-aware. "We have the most remarkable woman working on our Dega," Pemberton was saying. "Elena Vasquez. Perhaps you know her? She's quite brilliant, completely. Transformed our water-damaged Monet last year." Adrian managed something that might have been agreement, but his vocal cords had apparently forgotten their function. Because there she was. Elena knelt before an easel, her attention completely focused on a partially restored ballet scene. She wore jeans that hugged her legs like a lover's hands and a cream-colored sweater that had slipped off one shoulder, revealing the elegant line of her collarbone. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, secured with what appeared to be a paintbrush, and she had a small smudge of blue paint on her cheek. She was even more beautiful than he remembered. "Elena." "Dear," Pemberton called, "I'd like you to meet Adrian Blackwood." Her hand stilled on the brush. Slowly she turned, and those storm-gray eyes met his with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been irritation. "Mr. Blackwood." Her voice was carefully neutral, professional. How unexpected. She rose with fluid grace, and Adrian's mouth went dry as he remembered exactly how she'd looked in that purple dress. How the fabric had showcased every curve now hidden beneath conservative work clothes. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The way she'd moved, the confidence in every line of her body, the devastating combination of beauty and brains that had left him reeling. "Ms. Vasquez." He extended his hand, and when she took it, the brief contact sent electricity up his arm. "We meet again." "Indeed." She released his hand quickly, turning back to Pemberton. "James, I should let you gentlemen get to your business. I'll finish this section tomorrow." "Nonsense." Pemberton waved her protest away. "Join us for dinner, I insist. Besides, Adrian here is quite the art collector. I'm sure you two have much to discuss." Elena's smile was polite and sharp enough to cut glass. "How kind. Though I imagine Mr. Blackwood's interest in art is more about investment potential than artistic merit." The barb hit home, just as she'd intended. Adrian felt that familiar heat creep up his neck, the same feeling he'd experienced at the museum, when she'd dissected his character with surgical precision. "You'd be surprised," he said quietly. "Some of us actually appreciate beauty for its own sake." Their eyes locked, and something electric sparked between them. Elena's cheeks flushed slightly, and Adrian realized with savage satisfaction that she wasn't as immune to him as she pretended. "How illuminating," she murmured, but her voice had gone slightly breathless. Pemberton, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, clapped his hands together. "Wonderful. This will be delightful. Elena, you simply must tell Adrian about your work on the Caravaggio. Absolutely fascinating process." As they moved toward the dining room, Adrian fell into step beside Elena, acutely aware of her presence. Beside him. She'd changed clothes, now wearing a simple black dress that was modest by any reasonable standard, but somehow made his pulse race because he knew the body beneath it. He'd memorized every curve in that purple dress, and the knowledge tortured him. This was madness. Adrian Blackwood didn't chase women who insulted him. He didn't spend weeks obsessing over someone who'd made it clear she found him lacking. He didn't rearrange business meetings for the chance to see a woman who'd walked away from him without a backward glance. But as Elena laughed at something Pemberton said, the sound like music in the elegant dining room, Adrian realized he was past caring about logic. She'd gotten under his skin, into his blood, and he was beginning to suspect she was going to stay there whether he wanted it or not. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The restaurant was intimate, exclusive, and exactly the kind of place Adrian Blackwood used to impress women who were easily impressed. But Elena Vasquez was not easily impressed, which was precisely why he'd spent 2 weeks orchestrating this moment. She sat across from him in a burgundy dress that was more conservative than the purple number that still haunted his dreams, but no less devastating. The color brought out the warmth in her storm-gray eyes, and Adrian found himself fighting the urge to stare like a lovesick teenager. I have to admit, Elena said, cutting her salmon with precise movements. I'm curious why Adrian Blackwood would spend 2 weeks convincing James Pemberton to arrange a dinner between us. Surely the great mogul has better uses for his time. Adrian sipped his wine, studying her over the rim of his glass. In the month since their first encounter, he'd learned she was brilliant, passionate, completely immune to his wealth, and more intriguing than any puzzle he'd ever tried to solve. He'd also learned that getting her alone was nearly impossible. Maybe I wanted to continue our conversation from the museum, he said. What conversation? As I recall, I told you exactly what I thought of you, and you stood there looking like a fish out of water. Her smile was wicked. Not that it wasn't entertaining. The familiar heat of challenged pride flared in his chest, but it was tempered now by something else, genuine admiration for her complete fearlessness. No one spoke to him the way Elena did. No one had ever dared. You certainly didn't pull. Your punches, he admitted. Trust fund baby, inherited wealth, no original thoughts. I believe those were your exact words. Among others. She leaned back in her chair, studying him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense he'd ever constructed. Are you here to prove me wrong? Because I should warn you, I'm rarely wrong about people. Actually, Adrian said, setting down his wine glass, I'm here because you were right. The admission hung between them like a live wire. Elena's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in her composure he'd managed to achieve. Excuse me? Adrian felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of armor he'd worn for so long he'd forgotten it was there. You were right, about all of it. I did inherit most of my fortune. My grandfather built Blackwood Industries. My father expanded it, and I just maintained it. I do drive expensive cars and date women who can't spell controversy. And yes, I probably haven't had an original thought since my trust fund matured. Elena set down her fork, her expression shifting from smug satisfaction to something more complex. I wasn't expecting that. You shook something loose in me that night, Adrian continued, his voice quieter now, more honest than he'd been in years. Made me look at myself through someone else's eyes for the first time since, hell, maybe ever. And what I saw wasn't particularly impressive. She was quiet for a long moment, those storm-gray eyes searching his face. And now what? You've seen the light and decided to become a better person? Forgive me if I'm skeptical. I donated $50 million to arts education programs, he said simply. Anonymous donations to 12 different organizations, including the community center where you teach. Elena's eyes widened. You? What? I also started actually reading the art books I've been collecting for years instead of just buying them because they looked good on my shelves. Did you know Caravaggio was probably gay and definitely a murderer? Fascinating guy. A laugh escaped her, surprised and genuine. You've been doing homework. I've been trying to become someone worthy of your respect. The words came out more vulnerable than he'd intended, and Adrian felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling with each syllable. Because that night, at the museum, when you looked at me like I was just another entitled rich boy, it was the first time anyone had ever seen me clearly. And you were right to be unimpressed. Elena reached for her wine, but he noticed her hand wasn't quite steady. This is very strange, you know. Men like you don't usually engage in this level of self-reflection. Men like me don't usually meet women like you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Elena's cheeks flushed slightly, and Adrian saw her careful composure wavering. You can't just... she started, then stopped, shaking her head. This doesn't change anything. You're still a millionaire with inherited wealth and expensive tastes, Adrian finished. Still someone who's had everything handed to him on a silver platter. I can't change my past, Elena, but I can change what I do with my future. Why? The question came out softer than she'd probably intended. Why does it matter what I think? Adrian leaned forward, letting her see the truth he'd been hiding for weeks. Because you're extraordinary. Because you look at a damaged painting and see something worth saving, not something to be discarded. Because you turned down a prestigious job to maintain your integrity, and you teach kids in Brooklyn how to create beauty in a world that tries to crush their spirits. Because you wore that purple dress like armor and took me apart with surgical precision, and I've never been more attracted to anyone in my life. Elena's breath caught, her eyes widening at his confession. Adrian, I know you think I'm just another spoiled rich boy, he continued, his voice rough with honesty. And maybe I am. But you made me want to be better. You made me want to earn the right to be in the same room as someone like you. She stared at him for a long moment, emotions flickering across her face too quickly for him to decipher. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. That dress cost me 3 months of ramen dinners. The non sequitur caught him off guard. What? The purple dress. The one I wore to the museum. Her smile was self-deprecating. I bought it because I wanted to feel beautiful at that gala, wanted to belong in that world for one night, but it cost me 3 months of eating nothing but ramen and peanut butter sandwiches. And when I saw you looking at me like I was just another pretty accessory to add to your collection, I attacked first. Before you could dismiss me the way men like you usually dismiss women like me. Understanding hit him like a physical blow. You thought I was going to judge me for not belonging there, for being the girl who saves up for months to afford one designer dress while you probably spend more than my yearly salary on ties. Elena's laugh was shaky. But then you kept coming back. And James kept mentioning you, saying you'd been asking about art restoration techniques, about the community center, about... She met his eyes. About me. Elena. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. You were the most beautiful woman in that room, and it had nothing to do with what you were wearing. Though, a smile tugged at his lips. That dress was spectacular. She looked down at their joined hands, and Adrian held his breath. This is insane, she whispered. We're from completely different worlds. So were Cinderella and Prince Charming. This isn't a fairy tale, Adrian. No, he agreed, lifting their joined hands to press a soft kiss to her knuckles. It's better, because it's real. When Elena looked up at him, her storm-gray eyes were bright with unshed tears and something that looked dangerously like hope. You really donated $50 million? Would you like to see the receipts? She laughed, the sound like music in the intimate restaurant. You know what the most ridiculous part of all this is? What? I've been thinking about you, too. The admission was quiet, vulnerable. About that night, about the way you looked at me, about whether I was too harsh. She shook her head. I told myself you were just another arrogant millionaire, but I couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if I'd given you a chance. Adrian felt something shift in his chest, hope blooming like a flower after rain. And now? Elena smiled. The real smile he'd been craving for weeks, not the sharp-edged weapons she usually wielded. Now I think maybe we should find out. As the waiter brought their dessert, Adrian Blackwood realized he'd never been happier to be wrong about anything in his life. Elena Vasquez had indeed seen him clearly that night at the museum, seen through his money and his suits and his practiced charm to the man underneath who was desperately trying to be worthy of her attention, and maybe, just maybe, he was finally becoming someone who was. The purple dress had started this, but Adrian was beginning to suspect their story was just beginning.